Hello, everyone. How are you tonight? Thank you for being here. My name is Bonnie Brzozowski. I'm a public services librarian at the Corvallis-Benton County Public Library, and I'm here to welcome you to this presentation tonight titled Mary's Peak Transformed. This is the first in the 2024 Liz and Bob Frankel Environment and Hiking Spring Webinar Series. The theme for this year's series is Mary's Peak, so we are going to learn all about this iconic local backdrop. There are two virtual events in addition to this one that are part of the series. The next one will be on Thursday, April 11th at 7 p.m. It's called Transforming Mary's Peak. And then we also have another on Thursday, May 9th at 7 p.m., Imagining Mary's Peak. You can learn more about what will be discussed in these events, as well as register for them at the links I'm going to share in the chat right now. So let me get there if you don't mind bearing with me. And here we go. Registration is required for these events, so please do register. And just a heads up that all registrants will be sent a link to a video recording of the event after it is finished. So as I'm sure you've noticed, we're using Zoom tonight. Please feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation, and we'll try to answer some of those at the end of the presentation. If you look around, you should be able to click or tap on a question mark to submit questions. So that's all I've got for you now. I'm going to hand you over to Dave Eckert, the program chair for the Mary's Peak group of the Sierra Club, who's going to tell us more about the series co-sponsors, and our fantastic presenters. So Dave, take it away.
All righty. Thank you, Bonnie. And let me make sure I get the right one here. Okay, and there we go. Well, thank you, Bonnie, for hosting through the library. This is just a wonderful experience that we've had with you. The title of tonight's is Mary's Peak Transformed. Notice that is in the past tense, and I'm using a picture here. Can't remember who I got it from, but to me, it has everything in it. It has cars, it has horses, it has people, it has a marching band, it has guns, it has flags, people saluting, and it has people tromping all over the meadow. It's just a wonderful photo showing that we have transformed it. And also, like Bonnie said, this is the Liz and Bob Frankel spring lecture series. Bob and Liz were iconic forces of nature and passed away just about 5-6 years ago. And they were Mr. and Mrs. Mary's Peak. And I could go on for an hour on that, but we've since they passed away, we have now named the series after them for all their great work on Mary's Peak and the environment in general. We live in Champenofu, and the Champenofu goes all the way up the north and east side of Mary's Peak, and it's the land of the Ampenofu, and they have been here since time immemorial, and they're still here and living throughout the region, but based out of the Grand Ronde and the Silettes, and just honor them and look to develop all the reciprocal relationships we can and to learn from them also. The three sponsors of this, the Mary's Peak group of the Sierra Club, founded the series a long time ago, renamed it in something like 2018 or 19 after the Frankels. And when the pandemic started, we'd always shown them at the library live. And when the pandemic started, went to the library and said, do you have any ideas? And they said, well, we'd love to work with you and produce webinars. And it's just been a wonderful, wonderful partnership since then. And this year we invited the Mary's Peak Lions of Afrana on because this is about Mary's Peak. And so I wanted to make sure they were involved also. If you haven't already seen this video about Mary's Peak, we made in 2020, you really, and you have any interest in Mary's Peak at all, you need to see this. You go on Vimeo, vimeo.com, you can see at the bottom. And then when you search while you're on video, just go Mary's Peak field trip. And and bring that up. It's a 1 hour, but you can watch it in 3-minute intervals because there's it's just, it tells you things you've never known, and we're not going to go over it tonight. So it's just a wonderful way to learn about Mary's Peak. The series we have, since we worked with the library, are all on YouTube. And you can go on YouTube and just link to Liz and Bob Frankel lecture series. It's on the library's website, and you have now the links from Bonnie. But you'll see they're always in threes. So the first one was on the gift series, the gift from the Frankels that they gave to the Jackson Fraser Wetland, Mary's Peak, and the Bald Hill Natural Area. Just you'll learn a lot about all three of those in there. The second year was on Beavis, get the thing, Corvallis beavers, and there were 3 on that one also, looking at beavers in a way that you just won't find anywhere else. And then last year's on reviving wetlands, and these are all local wetlands, Herbert and Owens Farm, and I think it was, Owens Farm and Jackson Fraser. I think that was it. But this year it's transforming Mary's Peak. And look at, those are 2 pictures taken, one in 1910, and I'm pretty sure Phil Hayes took this one in 2016 at the bottom. Look how different they look in so many ways. I'm not going to go over it, but you see a road, you see forest where there is no forest, you see invasive plants in the lower, and you don't see in the top one. So we are transforming it, but the first one is about transformed, and you already saw this picture, so we'll be going over that shortly on what's happened over the last 200 years. How have we already transformed it? The next one we're going to have in April is on what's being transformed now, or how are we transforming it now as we speak? And we'll have 5 speakers on that. And then the third one is imagining Mary's Peak into the future. And we're going to talk mostly about an interpretation plan that Mary's Peak Alliance is working directly with the Forest Service on, and we'll be working with the public on, and how we can imagine what our influence will be on Mary's Peak in the future. So tonight, Mary's Peak Transformed, we have 3 speakers. Phil Hayes is going to be the first speaker. Judy Junckman was going to be the second speaker. She took ill yesterday, and so I'm taking over, and I'll be ad-libbing, so you'll have to be very kind. I'm using her narrative and most of her pictures, so bear with me when I do that. And the third person is Kevin Bruce, who will be talking about a larger issues, which I'll tell you about later. But let me first introduce Phil. And Phil has lived in Corvallis since the early 1970s, got his doctorate in microbiology, and became one of the foremost experts on the native plants of Mary's Peak, and wrote this sort of the seminal document on, or most authoritative one on the native plants of Mary's Peak with Bob Frankel and Esther McAvoy. He has been at the forefront of just every issue around Mary's Peak over the last 50 years. And he's going to be talking about who is Mary and about the naming of Mary's Peak. And and I'll be introducing Kevin a little later. So remember, enter your questions throughout the program in the Q&A feature, not the chat. So, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end from your written questions. So I'm done. And Phil Hayes, I'd like to introduce Phil Hayes. Take it off, Phil.
Got a pot. Okay. Hello. Does that look okay?
That's good. Great. Good job.
Okay. Well, early settlers called Mary's Peak by a variety of names, including St. Mary's Peak, Mount Snelling, June Peak, Shintamity, Mount Avery, and Mount Kellum. I'm sure you all have heard those before. They called Mary's River the River de Souris, or the River of Mice, and River Laurie. And Marysville was first called Avery's and is now Corvallis.
Phil, it's not forwarding.
I
Clicking-
haven't forwarded it yet.
Oh, okay, sorry.
How and when all of these monikers were applied is an interesting story. And of course, who was Mary? There have been endless speculation in newspapers about who Mary was. And Portland and Corvallis newspapers sort of had a friendly feud about which paper had the true story. Here's an example. Here's an example from the Oregonian in 1970. Marysville, Mary's River, Mary's Peak. Who was Mary? No doubt there are many at Corvallis who can tell us all about her, but what we want is the authentic and indisputable tale. Well, there are many. I'll start with the mountain, because that's probably the origin for all of the stories. A possible Kalapuyan name for the mountain is Chantamanui. Chan means place of, and Tamanui was a Kalapuya word for spirits. So Chantamanui is used in a Kalapuya spirit song referencing Mary's Peak that was recorded by an anthropologist in 1877. And this was from a native Kalapuyan from the Grand Ronde area. Different villages had different pronunciations, so we do not know for sure this is what the Mpenefu people of Corvallis called it. And you can see on the screen, trying to put this in English, you get several possible spellings. A variation of Chantamanui was published in June 1900 in a poem by B.F. Irvin called Shintimony. And then Professor Horner at Oregon Agricultural College further popularized the name with his legend of Shintimony. It's pure fiction, but a lot of people believed it. Like 1,000 snows have fallen and the hills have blossomed again and again since it lived the Indian maiden Shintimony. Well, he made that story up. But this is an example of where it went. Like this, here's a newspaper article from the Gazette in 1900. This towering monarch to our west, to whom the children of the forest had applied soft names of beauty and worth, has been robbed of his sex and name and reduced in his station to Mary's Peak. Okay, this guy seems to think that Shintimony was a guy. That's not what Horner said. Fortunately, we had newspaper editors and wanting to rename the unharmonious Mary's Peak to the more melodic Mount Shintimony. Women's clubs and U.S. senators endorsed the name change. But fortunately, that never happened. But some other things around Corvallis did pick up the Shintimony misnomer. Frenchman Duflat de Montfrost explored the Northwest in 1841. He published his notes in Paris in 1844, including an atlas containing this map of Western Oregon and the Willamette Valley. His notes and atlas are apparently the first written records for this area, and where anybody tried to do a geographical record of the area. There is an unverified claim that an old French map shows Mount Sainte-Marie positioned about where Mary's Peak is. Well, de Montfrost included in name Mont Sainte-Marie on his map, but it's up near Fort Vancouver in the Portland area. It's not around here. I'm sorry, something distracted me there. Dufrost included that map, Mont Sainte-Marie, and you might mistake that for Mount Sainte-Marie, but it's actually the monastery St. Marie. And he also included the monastery St. Louis at Gerbai and the monastery St. Paul at St. Paul, Oregon. And I wonder if this is the map, the rumor that Mount St. Marie was shown out west of where Corvallis is today. Now, there are several recorded accounts saying that early Catholic French Canadian trappers called the mountain Mount St. Marie. Some early settlers in Corvallis called the mountain St. Mary's Peak, and the name was still used in a 1900 newspaper article. But apparently Protestant settlers dropped the saint, and now we have Mary's Peak. But that's not the end of the story. There had often been an association between the names of the river and the mountain. Some call Mary's Peak Mouse Mountain because of the river's name. So others call the river St. Mary's River because of the mountain's name. The Gibbs-Starling map was produced in 1851 during the treaty talks with the Willamette Valley tribes in Champoeg. It identifies the mountain as Mount Snelling. The map also names Mary's River along the channel flowing from the mountain that is today called Greasy Creek. So there's Mount Snelling, and a map produced on 20 October 1852 by John Preston, the first Surveyor General of the Oregon Territory, also labels the peak Mount Snelling. Now, I have spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out who Snelling is, and I have no idea. But what's interesting, this is 20 October. The next day, 21 October, Preston produced another one of his maps, and he calls it Mary's Peak. So this is the first map that I've found that actually has the mountain out there labeled as Mary's Peak. So that was in 1852. There are also other tales that it was called June Peak. I've only found one reference to that, but there was also a mountain down near Eugene that was called June Peak. Popular name. Probably the most interesting story was about old Judge Kellum, who was said to be the first white man to climb the mountain in 1854. Some locals started calling the peak Mount Kellum. And here is a quotation, a story from a local newspaper. It was one of the warm summer days when all were in the shade of some large oaks eating dinner that we saw upon Mary's Peak a smoke and fire. It caused quite a little excitement, some fearing a volcanic eruption. Their fears were, however, dispelled when the report went abroad that old Judge Kellum had started out early that day. He had learned that a proposition had been made in a local bar to name the mountain after the first white man who would climb to the summit. His equipment for the trip was lunch, a butcher knife, a hatchet, and 3 yards of factory, that's a cloth. The last named article was to be used in raising a signal on the summit. The old judge, in going up by a direct route, got down in deep canyons and under overhanging cliffs and unfortunately lost his hatchet. Being without his hatchet, he had no pole on which to raise his flag of muslin. So as a signal, he set the grass on fire. We think the name should be Mount Kellum, and justice to the memory of its explorer. That's the Corvallis Gazette on 21 August 1900. So there you have it, Mount Kellum. Another newspaper editor complained, Mary's Peak is bad, for it's not a peak at all. Mount Avery is far more appropriate. Mount Avery is more euphonious than the name Mary's Peak, and Mount Avery stands for a historic fact. Mount Avery is more befitting than Mary's Peak, and Mary's Peak sounds better than Chintamani, which is too jingling, bajiminy. That's the kind of stuff you get in the newspapers back then. It seems likely that the name Mary's Peak was derived from the name Mount St. Marie given to it by the early French Canadians who settled here. And Mary's doesn't have an apostrophe because the United States Geological Survey discourages possessive names. and doesn't want to show possession of natural features. And now you know. There is no shortage of stories about who or what the river was named for. The Klickitat Indians called it Woodchuck, in English, Deer River. John Work, an employee of the Hudson's Bay Company, recorded the name River Surrey, which is Mouse River, in his journal in 1833. He also called it River Laurie in 1834. Surrey, Laurie, what's the difference? Dufat de Mafrost, though, mapped the tributaries to the Willamette River in 1841. He included the name for Mary's River, River de Surrey, or River of the Mice. Johnson Moki, an early settler, said that in 1845, trappers told him the name of the river was Mouse River. We don't know what was mousy about it. Now, one of the early books, Oregon Place Names, an early list by William Steele, said Mary's River was named for Mary, the Indian wife of a settler who had difficulty crossing a stream. But this is very similar to other tales and seems to be a blend of several stories. Mary Stuart was an early pioneer, came here in 1847. They settled out north of town where Hewlett Packard is today. That's why Stuart Lake is out there. Some claimed J.C. Avery named the river after her. However, she is said to have stated the river was not named after her. She said the river was named after Mary Trimble. So who's Mary Trimble? Well, Mary Trimble attempted to ford the river on horseback about where Pioneer Park is today, but fell off and drowned. However, another account called her Miss Taylor. Both were white women. But this happened sometime after the early settlers arrived. Adam Wimple was a source of many of the stories about the names. He was an early settler who took up a claim east of Philomath in 1845. He said he named the river after his sister who lived in New York. "I will make my sister's name known forever," he said. But he also said he named the river after his niece, Mary. She was a frail child who spent her spare time sitting by the river's bank, watching the rippling stream and the mountain. When referring to either of the river or the mountain, she always called them her river or her mountain. And she died shortly after coming here in 1847. But that's not the only Wimple story. Some say Mary was Adam Wimple's 12-year-old wife by an arranged marriage. She apparently didn't like living with the 35-year-old Wimple. She pulled a gun on Wimple, who took it away from her and hit her on the head with it, killing her in 1852. For that, he was the first man hanged in Polk County. So it was Mary Wimple, Mary Wimple, and Mary Wimple. One of those popular stories tells that the river was named after Mary Lloyd, said to be the first white woman to cross the river in 1846. The Lloyds settled down near Monroe on the Long Tom. One version said she lifted her skirts and waded across. Another said she fell off a wagon in the river and then waded across. Her sister claimed it was Mary's River. This so pleased the group that one of them, Wayman St. Clair, gave the name to the river in her honor. St. Clair was a representative from this area in the legislature of the provisional government. Some of the Lloyd's relatives also claimed that Marysville and Mary's Peak were named for her. And a man named Marple said he named the river and mountain after his niece in Missouri. One account, and that's it. That's the last we hear of Marple. But when Joseph Avery filed his claim in 1845, he recorded the location as the junction of the Marys River and the Willamette River. This is actually the oldest recorded name, Marys River, and predates all other such claims. Avery's wife and son later said the river was called Marys River before any settlers came to this area. And in 1846, again, before most of the other claims, the Oregon legislature passed an act including the name Marys River. Now, how about the town? Corvallis was originally called Marysville. Well, almost originally. The story about the naming of Marysville is about as convoluted as the name of the river. Who was the Mary of Marysville? Some think the town was named for the river and the mountain. Joseph Avery was the first settler here in Corvallis, and he staked a claim in 1845. He marked off 12 acres of his land called Little Field for a town in 1847, downtown Corvallis. He decided to call it Marysville in 1849. Some local called it Mauriesville. A number of the early town folks say Avery named the town for Mary Stewart. Remember the river. She was one of the early settlers and the first white woman in town. And some people think this is the most credible account. But did Avery really name his town after another man's wife? People will be talking about this for years. And this is one I thought was odd. Eugene Skinner, founder of Eugene, Oregon, is said to have commented that Mr. J.C. Avery had named his town in honor of Mrs. Avery, whose name was Mary. Unfortunately, her name was Martha. It's also interesting that Skinner was planning to name his town Marysville, but Avery beat him to it, so he called his town Eugene. Bet you didn't know that. The first recorded name for the town was Avery's. That was the official name of the first post office in January 1850, so early 1850. It was located in Avery's store down on 2nd Street where Robinette's was. Avery was postmaster. But early post office records in Washington, D.C. listed it in April 1850, a little later, as Forks of St. Mary's River, but the Saint was lined out. And it looks like it was a clerical mistake that was corrected the same day. So there's a St. Mary's River reference, though. The post office name was changed to Marysville in late 1850. So there's by the way, that photo of 2nd Street, I think is the oldest known photo of Corvallis from 1869. Okay. Marysville, Oregon was on the same stagecoach route as Marysville, California, and the mail was being delivered to the wrong cities. To eliminate the confusion, Marysville, Oregon was renamed by the Oregon Territorial Legislature at Avery's request in December 1853 to Corvallis, a combination of Latin words for the heart of the valley. But not without a fight in the legislature. Because Salem, the capital was in Salem at that time, Salem was also trying to change its name to Corvallis. But Corvallis got the name, and the post office was renamed Corvallis in February of 1854. So there you have it. The authentic and indisputable tale. Now we know who Mary was. She was Mary, Suey, Laurie, June, Snelling, Lloyd, Wimple, Trimble, Taylor, Marple, Kellum, Stewart, Avery. Thanks. So that's my story. Now you know who Mary was.
All righty. Well, thank you. Thank you. Let's see if I got this. Thank you, Phil. This is great. Well, now that we know who Mary was, let's move on along to something else. Now, as I said at the beginning, or for those who came in a little late, this presentation was supposed to be given by Judy Juntunen. She took ill yesterday, and asked if I could substitute for, so I apologize for any glitches I make. Be talking about the Mary's Peak Trek. And so let me get Judy's notes. I'm using her notes, so I'm going to have to read. The year was 1946. World War II had ended. That's a picture from the top of Mary's Peak, by the way. And gas and tires were no longer rationed. People could once again take pleasure trips. This is taken from Mary's Peak. The Portland Shriners saw an opportunity to raise money for the Shriners Children's Hospital in Portland, and there it is. They planned a picnic near the top of Mary's Peak, the highest mountain in the Coast Range, and called it the Mary's Peak Trek. It was an excellent location, not far from Corvallis. Can you see it in the picture? Or from Albany, Salem, and Eugene. The mountain had a paved road to the large meadow near the top. And for almost 40 years, in August, the Mary's Peak Trek was held in the meadow. Before the trek, over the years, farmers had brought their livestock to the summer grazing, and people enjoyed the peak as a recreation area. But there was no doubt the consistent use of the meadow by the trek had the most damaging impact. People purchased trek buttons for the yearly event for a chance to win one of the prizes. The buttons were a big deal because the prizes were impressive. One of the prizes almost every year was a car. In 1971, two of the prizes were a 1971 Ford Torino 500 and a 15-foot Riviera boat with a Mercury motor and trailer. And an earlier trek, a 9-year-old boy won the grand prize and had a choice among a car, a modular house, or a trip to the Holy Land. The article did not say which one he chose, but I would guess it's the car. The goals of the trek were to raise money for the Shriners Children's Hospital and to encourage people to enjoy the peak as a recreational area. On the day of the trek, hundreds of cars went up the mountain until 1 o'clock. See the way they went up? And then after 1 o'clock, cars were only allowed to go down. By 1957, the trek was billed as the West's biggest picnic. And in 1961, it was reported that 12,000 people attended. The barbecue picnic, which started promptly at noon, featured nearly a ton of prime beef. Many who attended brought their own picnics, but sandwiches, soft drinks, and coffee were on sale. People sat in their chairs and blankets on the slope of the meadow's natural amphitheater facing the stage to eat their picnic and watch the stage show, which featured a large variety of acts and music. Some years, there was also an air show. In 1950, when television was new, the Shriners placed several TVs on top of the mountain where reception was excellent. When the lookout was still located on the top of Mary's Peak, many people took the trail to the summit and climbed to the viewing platform. If the weather was clear, they could not only see the Cascade Mountains to the east and the Pacific Ocean to the west, but over the years, the number attending the trek began to decrease. Only 2,000 attended in 1982, and the Shriners said attendance was down because of cloudy, cool, and sometimes wet weather. They also reported that since the trek began, over $900,000 had been raised for the Shriners Children's Hospital. The trek continued on Mary's Peak until 1984. After 1984, the trek was moved to Avery Park. Organizers found it much easier to put on a picnic at the park than on top of the mountain. And in 2007, Corvallis Gazette-Times announced that the trek would now be held in conjunction with the rodeo in Philomath. An article in November 10th, 1975 issue of the Barometers discussed the concern about the quality of water from the mountain's watershed. Since 1906, Corvallis has received some of its water from the east side of the Mary's Peak. One paragraph of that article addressed the damage to the meadow where the trek met every year. Now, this is a quote from that article. The meadow is suffering encroachment by the surrounding forest. Now, I'll deviate here. You notice what it was like in 1948 at the top? Look how it closed in by 2008. Okay, now I'm going to go back to the quote. This has been sped up. Oh no, I'll go back again. Here's two more pictures. Everything you see in snow at the top in 1920 was meadow. Look in 2016, there's almost none left that you can view from Corvallis. Okay, now I'll go back to the trek. This has been sped up by the presence of man and the exclusion of fire. The annual Mary's Peak trek, when several thousand people assault the peak for barbecue and a good time, caused damage to the fragile meadows. And you can see it right there. Okay, now no quotes here. During the trek, part of this meadow was used as a parking lot. Judy counted 900 cars in one photo. The meadows were badly damaged by the nearly 40 years of impacts by cars and other human activities. After the 1984 trek moved off the mountain, no big events were held in the meadow again. Now the meadows are slowly healing after receiving protection from such events and their impacts. 40 years later, visitors to the mountain are encouraged to stay on the designated trail and not go into the meadows. The Mary's Peak Meadows are a relatively small area that is home to a diverse collection of native plants. Because of the harsh climate and short growing season, the native plants that have survived are resilient to such harsh weather, but they are not resilient to humans. When people walk on the meadows, they do two things. First, they reduce the ability of the plants to produce seeds and reproduce, making it harder for them to survive year after year. Secondly, people introduce alien species. This is not alien here, but they introduce an alien species with seeds carried on their boots and shoes. The invaders compete for minerals and light. This reduces these native plants' chances from surviving. When people wander through natural habitats, the native plants are slowly lost and replaced by introduced weed species. This is why it is important to stay on official trails and walkways. While the Mary's Peak Trek was a great fundraiser and inspired many people to love Mary's Peak, the trek is a good example of loving Mary's Peak to death. There are many ways we can love, use, and protect Mary's Peak. I hope we can find ways to make visitors to the mountain aware of how easily this wonderful resource can be damaged. For example, two easy ways damage can be avoided is by staying off the meadow and using the designated trails. So while the Mary's Peak Trek accomplished its admirable goals of raising funds for the Children's Hospital and helping the local population enjoy Mary's Peak, unintentionally damage the physical features, the ecology, and the cultural resources. As we move forward, it is my hope that we all take into consideration how our actions on Mary's Peak are transforming it. And now let's go to, I'm going to turn this off. That was an example of one transformation. Let me get out of here. And so Kevin, if you can come on up and turn on your video. And Kevin has served as the Heritage Program Manager and Tribal Liaison for the Siuslaw National Forest for over 13 years. He has nearly 30 years of cultural resource management experience, primarily applied in the southeastern US and Oregon. His archive of our activities around Mary's Peak is second to none, and he is a critical resource for anyone interested in Mary's Peak. Bruce will talk about a wide variety of cultural activities that have occurred on Mary's Peak since the 1800s that have transformed Mary's Peak from what it was pre-1900 and continue to transform it right up to current times. Kevin, Bruce, it's an honor. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Dave, and good evening, everyone. I'll try and get my screen shared here.
Perfect.
Looking great. So yes, as Dave mentioned, tonight I'm talking about the historic land management and use of Mary's Peak. And really I'm going to focus on the last 150 years of use, specifically with the Euro-American contact. So let's the next slide. As Dave had mentioned before, I do want to acknowledge as well that this is the ancestral homeland Ampa Mary's River band of the Kalapuya. So you know, the peak's been of cultural importance for millennia and continues to be so for members of Grand Ronde and Siletz. And, you know, one thing about Mary's Peak is it's continued to be of such importance even to folks here in Oregon for numerous generations now. It's definitely a place of importance to many people. And one thing, even though I'm talking about the last 150 years, it's good to understand kind of what people came to as they moved into the Willamette Valley and the Mary's Peak areas in the 1840s and 50s. When people came into the Willamette Valley, you know, it was often described as park-like and just pretty much something idealistic. And, you know, this wasn't just nature at work. This was the work of the Kalapuya people using fire and other land management tools to create an environment that was conducive to the tribe's subsistence and lifeways. The use of fire was very important in creating conditions that produce oak savanna type of environments and grasslands on peaks like Mary's Peak. And this was done to promote resources that were important to the tribe, like camas and oak for the acorns, as well as tar reed and a variety of other resources. So when Euro-American settlers came here, they came to a pretty idyllic setting. So understanding that when people first came to this area, you know, what did Mary's Peak look like? And from early descriptions, it was pretty much described as an open grassy bog. As you can see in the slide here, we have the 1879 GLO survey plat for Township 12 South, Range 7 West, which, you know, for those that don't know, it's pretty much like a 23,000 acre area, a township and range. And here you can see noted is a grassy meadow area that was mapped at that point, which is the Mary's Peak summit. So, you know, the area was obviously open, also evident from a sketch here from a history of Benton County produced by Fagan in 1885. You can see in the background of the picture, just the Mary's Peak looking pretty much with no trees and just grassland. And this kind of matches with what we have described in early newspaper articles and early accounts of people coming into the valley. One thing also to be aware of as far as understanding the condition at the time when the Euro-Americans first started coming into the area was the impact of large fires that occurred. In the mid-19th century, there were several large fires that came over from the Coast Range came over from the east side of the Coast Range all the way to the coast. And one of direct impact to the Marys Peak area was the Yaquina Fire. It occurred sometime around 1849 to 1853, based on what historical accounts that we have of the fire. And estimates have it as burning around 450,000 acres, running from the crest of the Coast Range over all the way north to the South Fork of the Siletz River, and to the south to the mouth of the Siuslaw River. The map here, if you can see my cursor, here's Marys Peak. And this red area would be the extent in this township and range of the Yaquina Fire based on GLO notes. Basically, I just roughly mapped in where areas described as being burned during the 1875 and 1878 surveys occurred. And this matches to what historic accounts mention as far as the area having burned timber to the west of Marys Peak. So as Euro-American settlers came into the area, obviously they filled up the Willamette Valley first and started moving up into the tributaries and other areas adjacent to Marys Peak. But really the first that we know of settler on Marys Peak proper on the summit was Alex Osborne. Don't have much information. He homesteaded, not really homesteaded, he had a preemption claim there on the top of the peak. And basically this was just a cast entry, so not a homestead entry. So in 1866, Osborne went to the Marys Peak on his claim and took his family, according to this 1900 newspaper article in the Corvallis Gazette, and established a dairy there and actually made cheese. So I'm assuming probably the earliest cheese making in the area. And it's noted that he made cheese there for a couple of years. In another article, it said a few years. And then he also took up sheep, horses, and cattle as well, because it was a grassy knoll. So it makes sense to the grazer stock there. We do know later that that Osborne sold his land to William Wyatt, which we'll talk about a bit here, where they also drove stock. But even at that point, it was noted that the mountain was also a summer resort for people. So as early as the 1860s and 70s, people definitely started to take advantage of the beauty of the peak and hiking up there and enjoying the setting that it has to offer. Talking about the next owner, another article from the Corvallis Gazette from 1883 talks about how the peak was bald and covered with the finest native grasses, 300 to 400 acres of open land. And William Wyatt here, who acquired the land from Osborne, used it for a horse pasture during the summer months. And from what I understand, anecdotally, other settlers from the valley also ran their stock up to Marys Peak over the course of the summer month for a number of years. And, you know, what this did do, I suspect, was it helped reduce the encroachment of conifers, but it also began to introduce non-native invasive species that are there now and continue to be introduced there and having impacts on the peak. This lower picture isn't quite from that age, but this is a photo from 1937 before the lookout was constructed. So it just giving you an idea of what it sort of looked like probably at that time, just a pretty much bald, open grassy area. So just a note, I already mentioned that it was already noted as a summer resort area. So early recreation uses definitely started pretty much as soon as people started coming into the valley. It was pretty popular for folks that go out for a weekend excursion, for people that do a hike for a long day. And as noted in this 1870 article, it was noted as a popular resort, and that the many attractions included hunting and fishing and such. And as you move through time, you started having hiking groups, which is I find kind of interesting here. From the Morning Oregonian in 1916, the Magzamas group had 40 people come and hike up to Marys Peak, and this was the first time for the group. And it noted that it was a popular goal for students from what is now Oregon State University, Oregon Agricultural College, to make that trek. So it's always been a popular place for recreation, just a little more difficult to get there at that point in time than now. Logging in the area, you know, this is the Pacific Northwest. Logging is important. You know, there is a bountiful number of trees, producing excellent lumber, excellent resources. And in the Marys Peak area, you had most of the activity occurring to the east side of Marys Peak, just noting the early fires that had consumed most of the west side. This was an interesting article from 1904 in the Gazette from the Benton County Lumber Company. And I love the description talking about the inexhaustible supply of the finest fir and cedar that lies into the east and south of Marys Peak. And, they had a mill operating with numerous employees and the 7 Mile flume where they brought lumber down. This picture was there crossing the Marys River around Philomath. And this is actually pictures from the Benton County Historical Society. And what was important about lumber in Marys Peak and logging is it also stirred a debate in that you had the Woods Creek Logging Railroad also starting to work and cut timber going up the Woods Creek watershed up towards Marys Peak. So it started operation in 1909 and ran through 1928. Had 3 different owners, W.C. Noon, Charles K. Spalding, and Clarence Cameron. And at its longest, it reached 11 miles up the drainage. And this spurred a lot of debate in Corvallis because there was concerns about damage to the watershed. And we'll talk about why that was important. But here's a map actually showing from Noon Junction here, which is just outside of Philomath, heading west. And this is the extent that the railroad logging outfit went. So right up to the slope of Marys Peak there. And you can see the Corvallis watershed property mapped there. So this stirred debate in Corvallis because the city began using water from the Rock Creek drainage in 1906. At that point, it supplied most all of the city's water. And I think for a number of years, it still produces, and maybe now even a third. So there was a lot of consternation about logging activities up the Woods Creek drainage and getting close to the city's Rock Creek watershed. So there was multiple efforts to petition Congress to set aside lands for municipal watershed protection and bring in the Forest Service. And this triggered in 1920 the first acquisition of land that went to the Forest Service for protection of the municipal watershed. And this continued this effort. So 1920 was the first acquisition of land. And then there was actually an act of Congress that created the Marys Peak Purchase Unit that allowed for lands to come into the forest as far as actually expanding the forest boundary to cover that area. So lands could be taken into the Sayuso National Forest more easily. So that occurred in 1936. And by 1940, most of the timbered lands within the Rock Creek watershed had been purchased by either the city of Corvallis or the Forest Service, protecting the water shed for the city of Corvallis and Philomath. So at around the same time too, as far as at the end of that acquisition period, the city acquired the Summit. It was the last private inholding at the peak. So the city acquired that remaining 440 acres on the Marys Peak Summit. And in 41, the city leased 400 acres to the Forest Service. And it was specified only use of public for the public purposes. And also they donated 40 acres there, which is where the fire lookout was constructed, which we'll talk about a bit later. And here's another panoramic shot for those that haven't seen these before. These are taken with Osborne cameras, basically, that were taken from lookouts all over Oregon. And this was in 37, so right before the lookout was constructed, nothing was up at the peak at that point. So a great view and showing the open grass, bald environment, and a lot less trees and definitely that had encroached in the meadow at that point in time. So around this time, that was the 1930s and early 40s with those acquisitions. Around the same time, you had the New Deal programs happening, and the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration, they had huge impacts on this entire region and for the Forest Service. And here it's Marys Peak. And one of the biggest impacts was the construction of Marys Peak Road, which started in 1938 and was finished in 1941. There was actually a camp at kind of just off the highway, the Mary's Peak camp that was in place. And I think they had, noted they had 50 members noted in 1938. And they had 4 or 5 barrack structures and multiple outbuildings there at their spur camp. So, and they constructed the road for 3 years there in conjunction with the Works Progress Administration, in addition to doing a variety of other tasks, including, fire suppression and logging and other works. But in general, the city had been pushing for the construction of a road to the peak. They definitely viewed a road as important to open it up for recreation access. There was lots of discussion over the years of having a resort at top, making it a prime winter sports park area. And in general, just because it was such a popular area already, just to provide better access to the peak. And in addition, at this point in time, it also created access for logging and also fire suppression. So along that lines, we had fire lookouts and fire suppression activities around the same time with the CCC in particular. So they constructed multiple lookouts, not just at Mary's Peak, but surrounding Mary's Peak. In 1941, they constructed the Alsea Summit and Pioneer Butte to the south and east of Mary's Peak. And then in 1942, they finished the Mary's Peak Lookout, which was the first on the summit, which you can see in this picture below. And it's pretty interesting in that no just permanent structure was there before. There were lookouts around Mary's Peak, but they tended to be more along the lines of tents and people going up to the peak and setting up lookouts, not permanent structures like what you see here and later. And also, the CCC also worked in the area to construct fuel breaks in the area, and then also support fire suppression activities. And this is one of the kind of lasting effects as well that you have with the Forest Service is, fire suppression was at the heart of what the Forest Service does, and especially did then in the Coast Range. People don't think of fire the same way as you see in Southern Oregon, or even now over into the into the Cascades, even the Western Cascades. But fire was much more prevalent then, and there was a lot of emphasis put on fire suppression. And one thing just to toss out there, there was also reforestation efforts. In 1943, there was a large reforestation effort, one of the first in this area, led by the Civilian Public Service, which was the conscientious objectors. And basically they planted over, was it 500,000 Doug fir and Port Orford cedars at that time. And they stayed at the CCC spur camp. And they did that over the course of the entire 1943 summer. So interesting, and it was one of the first reforestation efforts, and I believe it was on ONC land. So I'm not sure if these were areas that were burned previously and hadn't been restocked from the Oquina burn. There was also a fire in 1931-32 that burned some of this area. So I have a feeling that might be what it's associated with. And jumping forward back to recreation again, recreation in the 40s through the 1960s really changed the use of Mary's Peak. Dave already alluded to things that happened with the Shriners Trek. And really, all this was kind of predicated on the construction of Mary's Peak Road. It really opened up the area for public access. At the same time, when the Peak Road was opened up, the picnic campground was constructed as well in 1941. And as well as I mentioned, the fire lookout, which was also an observatory. People could go to the second level deck and get great views of the area. It was very popular for people to go there and for the observation deck as well. And as Dave mentioned, in 46, the Shriners Trek started and drew thousands and went through 84. And just probably the same photo Dave showed earlier, but one thing about this, it was very popular, but obviously lasting impacts to the meadow and area. We'll talk about that a little more later. And some other things that occurred there, you had the Hilonsky Ski Club, which maintained a ski hut until 1959 and operated a small portable ski tow from 42 to 52 as well. Winter sports were pretty popular. I think the ideal in the early days was that you were going to have a much larger winter snow park developed there. But I think there were issues with some winter with not much snow that basically ended the small portable ski tow. And for some reason, it never really developed like the city had wanted. Jumping forward out of the recreation world into some large events in the 1950s and 60s that really affected Mary's Peak and the surrounding area. And the first one was a 1951 Douglas bark beetle outbreak. And this was an event that occurred over the Pacific Northwest. In the Rock Creek drainage, over 60 million board feet of timber was scattered by 1952 through the Rock Creek watershed because of this beetle outbreak. And this was new. The area hadn't been roaded or really heavily logged at that point in time at all within the watershed, obviously, because it was protected to maintain water quality for the city of Corvallis. Well, this spurred the development of a timber salvage program for the watershed and led to the salvage of 64 million board feet of timber. And this led to the development of a road system, which, to support future incidents like this beetle outbreak and for fire protection. And over the region in general, this really spurred a lot of development of roads and salvage logging. So it kind of opened the door for more intensive production in certain areas. And the picture I have above, you can see, was taken prior to I think that was 1951 or 52 with the beetle outbreak here, kind of the light patches where you have dying trees, and below directly after some of the salvage logging, you can see in pictures here. So pretty serious change in conditions. This was taken from a harvest atlas for the township 12 South and 7 West. You can see Mary's Peak here, and pretty much all these colored polygons were timber units that were associated with the Douglas fir beetle salvage operation. So it made a real impact to the forest in this area. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The second large event in this period was in 1962 with the Columbus Day storm, or Typhoon Frida, basically. And this was another huge event that impacted the entire Pacific Northwest. For Mary's Peak, you had lots of blowdown. Here you can see a picture of trees falling down around the Mary's Peak campground, logs being trucked off of Mary's Peak. This actually is a picture from up further north in the forest, but kind of just representative of what kind of impacts occurred. And I went through our records and just saw within just the years of 1963 to 64, just in that one township, 23,000 acres, basically, the Forest Service had 20 timber salvage sales in the 1963 to 1964. So it was a huge impact and really created a situation where there was a change in forest and also a huge boon for the industry. Jumping forward, one of the other issues, or say impacts or changes for sure in management of Mary's Peak is the communication site and the lookout. Prior to the 1941 construction of the lookout, no structures were at the summit. So that kind of opened the door for having structures there, which obviously for visuals, is an impact. People see it, it stands out. So in 1941, that structure was built, and then the next event was the Air Force coming in and constructing a radar station in 1958 to 59. And basically this was a gap filter station for the surface SAGE system, surface air ground environment. For those who are aware of the Mount Hebo Air Force Station, on the north part of the Coast Range on the forest, there was a radar station there, and as well as the Adair Air Force Station there. This was connected to both of those. So along with the Air Force radar station, the road going up to the top of the peak was constructed by the Air Force in 1958. So this really kicked off the start of kind of electric communication sites in the area. And what's interesting is the Air Force Station, basically the radar was blown down, I think by a storm in 59 or 60, and the Air Force Station removed all the equipment and transferred it to the Forest Service, so it was never even really fully functional. So, but that did start the era of electronic communication sites on the peak. So in 1961, we had the second Mary's Peak Lookout was constructed there. And I should say that the original lookout was burned in 1959. Unfortunately, the CCC did use local material, and I think that probably was Noble Fir the lookout was constructed of. So the weather on Mary's Peak isn't really conducive to long-term for a long life for a log structure like that on top of the peak. So that was burned in 59. And then you had the construction of a new lookout, and also the Forest Service basically took over the Air Force Station building to be their new communication site building, and the BPA constructed this building here adjacent to the lookout. And that was the start of the communication sites on the peak. Kind of an interesting story. It was quite a lot of consternation between the BPA and the Forest Service of what kind of communication site was going to happen here. BPA and wanted the Forest Service to have one large building, but it didn't work out that way because of financing, and it came where the BPA was basically going to build on another part of the peak, and the city of Corvallis came in and said no. You know, they wanted to minimize the footprint and impacts to the view shed. So they came to this agreement where the BPA had this building, the smaller building, the Forest Service had their separate communication site here. So communication site, you know, still here, still ongoing, obviously with the BPA expanding with the change in communication site occurring now on the top. So, but here's just a picture of the Forest Service building, the BPA building, and the older lookout, the second lookout. Kind of the next, one of the next big improvements there on the peak would be improvements on the Mary's Peak Road from 1968 to 74. So before the road wasn't paved and was basically a lane and a half road system. So the forest paved and expanded the road to 2 lanes, which opened up the area to even more recreational use, and also added a water system and restrooms at the observation station, and paved approaches to the meadow were also constructed. So you can see some interesting photos of the construction going on, and it was quite a project, that construction for sure. So jumping back to Mary's Peak Recreation in the 70s, I'd say the 2020s, in general, you just basically had continued recreation volume increase, and you had improvements with additional hiking trails and facilities. And also, I would say you've had some impacts again by weather. You had a strong windstorm that led to the closure of the original Mary's Peak Campground in 81. This map below here showed where the existing picnic and campground was located. This is the meadow area. And here's a picture of the blowdown that occurred in 81. So basically the campground got moved in 1985 to the location that it's in today. And in general, I would say just recreation, there's been more of an emphasis in interpretation and protecting sensitive resources. You know, I'll note just in the Mary's Peak Alliance work there on the peak with the Forest Service and other groups has been tremendous for interpretation and education. So, and one of the things leading kind of this change as well, as far as talking about protection of resources, and kind of like Dave alluded to before with the Mary's Peak, the Shriners Trek there, you know, there were lots of impacts to Mary's Peak, to the meadows and such. When he said people kind of love Mary's Peak to death, that was exactly what I was going to say. You know, such a special place, and people love it, but at times, it's led to overuse and impacts. And one of the things that happened with management there was with the Forest Service seeing that was a Mary's Peak Scenic Botanical Special Interest Area being developed. So it was established in 89, 924 area special interest area. And it was really about recognizing the special plant ecosystem there on the summit, and for protection, limiting impacts by recreationists, and the type of activities that could do impacts to the meadows and other sensitive plant communities there on the peak. And then also, when talking about use of the area and management, the Forest Service had the Northwest Forest Plan in 1994. I'm sure most are familiar with that, but the whole area was allocated around Mary's Peak as Late Soil Reserve. So this basically changed the potential treatment of all the forested lands there, as far as focus on late soil and old growth habitat, and just basically moving treatments towards things that put those forests on a trajectory to old growth in support of certain endangered species like the spotted owl and marbled murrelet. So a change for sure in management and land use there at Mary's Peak over the last 20, 30 years. And one thing that has also occurred recently, it was a discussion talking about, which Dave showed photos of the meadows basically being encroached upon by noble fir and other conifers, was the Mary's Landscape Management Project that the forest completed as far as the analysis from back in 2010 and started implementing in 2015. And part of that was the acknowledgement of that we're losing the meadows and this special habitat. So that project focused on removing conifers and really trying to restore and expand or open meadows back up more to their historical boundaries. So that is another kind of recognition of things that for land use and management that required some work from the Forest Service to be able to support this ecosystem. And I'll just say thank you for having me speak tonight. And just in summary, I also just want to say in general, there's some things that the Forest Service and other the city and the state and other vehicles in general for management have struggled with looking at the way things were and to where we're going, talking about how things have changed. And one of the things that you see in looking at tribal management is the use of fire, and how you've had encroachment on the meadows. And then also with recreation, it's such a love of Mary's Peak, but the balance of protecting resources and providing those opportunities for the public to really be able to enjoy Mary's Peak. So, I think that's been the two biggest issues there in Mary's Peak, and will continue to be the challenge for managers in the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. That's wonderful. So Bonnie, we'll go into
Yes.
Q&As now, and I accidentally answered one of the questions. I thought it was in the chat, so we'll go ahead. So go ahead and start in. And
Sure. And if Phil and Kevin want to join us on screen, I'm sure many of these questions might be fielded by y'all as well. So please join us if you're able. So the first question, Andrew asked, would there be any benefit to burning the Peaks Meadows, and what's the likelihood of that happening? And I think you may have mentioned this a little bit, Kevin.
Yeah, sorry. My computer's a little slower than my clicker. Yeah, I think there's a lot of interest in burning the meadow. On the Sisal, especially, we're more of a west side forest, and it's always a challenge on the timing for burning. Mary's Peak is actually probably in a position where it's a little more accessible as far as the timing to do it. And I think there's a lot of interest in working with the tribes to use fire as a traditional method of treatment for things like conifer encroachment, and also just in general in providing the nutrients to the soils and promoting native species. The other challenge is there are invasive species there. So it really does take a lot of thoughtfulness in figuring out, what the appropriate kind of burn schedule is, and it would probably require a lot of work, multiple treatments and such. But I think the Forest Service is definitely looking at doing more prescribed fire.
And if I can, thank you, Kevin, if I can chime in, that will be a question that will really be more relevant in the next, and we're talking about the past tonight. So talking about the future or the current, what's currently possible, we'll have a number of people on from the Forest Service and the BLM and the Marys River Watershed Council in the next talk. And we'll talk about more about the current and into the future type stuff. So yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks. Someone asked, when I go mushrooming in the late fall, I go off trail along the Northridge Trail, starting near Woods Creek Road. When you talk about how important it is to stay on trail, are you recommending I give up mushroom hunting, or does your admonition to stay on trail apply only to trails that run through the meadows?
I don't know, Phil, are you on? I haven't seen Phil up here yet, but since I was the one who said that, and I'm no authority on this, the biggest concern in Mary's Peak is in the top 1,000 feet. That's as Kevin mentioned, the scenic botanical interest area, special interest area, and below that 1,000 feet, I can't answer that, and I doubt that you'd be mushrooming in the top 1,000 feet anyway.
Thank you.
I would chime in on that and say what we're really concerned about are the areas that get traveled very heavily, primarily up near the summit, and particularly right around the very summit and the communication site area. We really need better traffic control, basically trails to keep people on and signs to keep them off. Down there on the lower end of Woods Creek Trail, I doubt very seriously if you would have any more impact than the deer would have, and prowling around through the woods looking for mushrooms.
Thank you. Great. Susan asks, is there now or has there ever been any general interest in calling the peak by its original Kalapuya name? I'm not going to try to pronounce it. She does say it's
Well,
Timanwi. Is that correct?
Since I'm the one who worked those names through for the Grand Run and the Silettes, I'll start on that discussion. And I noticed that Kevin's not on, so Kevin, I hope you're able to come back. When we did the naming of the 10 creeks, when I say we, it was the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde who named 6 in the Kalapuya language, and the other 4 were named by the Silettes in the Yukon and the Washeen languages. And so the whole issue of naming, we had 2 convenings, and there was a lot of discussion around that, and the tribes were very clear that they were not interested in renaming anything there. They know what they call it. They're very happy with what they call it. And the naming of the unnamed creeks, they were very happy to work on selecting indigenous names that made sense. And because it didn't have the political overtones to it and the political stress that renaming has. So and then the second thing I'd say is on the actual name, the Kalapuya name, I think Phil did a very good job of showing, remember Kalapuya was not a written language, it was a spoken language, and we really have very little evidence of what that spoken language sounded like. And every single band, there were 24 to 26 bands of Kalapuya, had a different dialect or version. So it would be definitely wrong for people who are not Kalapuya to say what the true name is. I think that's going into appropriation.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Someone asked, so I heard that there was an effort to get the Mary's Peak communication site removed. Can you speak to that effort, reasons for and against, and whether it's an ongoing endeavor, and who is or was leading that endeavor?
Phil, do you want to
Lots
do
of
that?
questions.
You're mute.
Would you repeat that question again?
Absolutely. So they're wanting to know that they say they heard that there's an effort to get the Mary's Peak communication site removed. And they're wondering like what the reasons for and against that would be and whether that's a current endeavor and who is leading it.
Well, yeah, there are a lot of people out there would say, yeah, we'd like to get rid of that. It is an ugly eyesore if you're standing up there on the top. But first of all, it's only used by government agencies. Okay, that was one of the things that came out of, Kevin talked about forming the Senior Botanical Special Interest Area. Well, Forest Service has been talking about making a special interest area in there for a number of years in the early 80s, but then Portland television station wanted to put an antenna farm up there because they wanted to broadcast games from OSU. And so I have a good friend who was with the SciS Law at the time, who was responsible for the area up on Mary's Peak, and they did not want an antenna farm up there. So they did real quick. They were going to wait until the 1990 forest plan was developed. But they changed it. They did real quick and ran that Scenic Botanic Special Interest Area in there. And the rules in that for the communication side are it's only government agencies. And you would be surprised at the government agencies that have communications up there. But it's also local rural fire districts depend on communication through that website. Through that communication site up there. And the sheriff and city police and all kinds of 911 agencies all have repeaters that go through that communication site. And those provide useful services to us down here in the flat. To get rid of that, and we've had some discussions, I've been involved in some discussions of this. It's like one of the fellow down at one of the rural fire districts down in Monroe said, yeah, we could put other communication sites on other hills around there, but they don't have the money for the equipment. So, yeah, I think it would be nice if the Air Force had never started this, but they did, and we're stuck with it. And it's just maybe someday satellite communications and everything will be so good that nobody will want to use the summit. I mean, that's what happened with, used to have a fire lookout up there, but they have such other facilities now. They don't need a fire lookout on Mary's Peak. Well, maybe someday we won't need a communication site up there, but don't hold your breath.
Thank you, Phil. I'm protecting Kevin here from speaking because it's a sensitive issue and it will be discussed in the next. Michelle Holman will be discussing that. And again, this is another question that's dealing with current and future as opposed to the past. And I'll just close this question by saying, yes, there were people who actually not protested. It wasn't protesting. It was filed an appeal, not a legal appeal, but internal Forest Service appeal, and suggested that the towers be put down on West Point. And there was reason to believe they could have, but it came up to the issue of money. And so you're going to hear the solution that was made, a compromise solution that was made. There was a lot of hard work that did go into that negotiation, and both by all parties. And so stay tuned to the next show. You'll hear more. Next question.
That's a great teaser. Great. Joni asks, at the base of the meadow, down from the parking lot, are some poles/posts with chains linking them. What was that built for? Does anybody know? To what she's referring?
Where was this again?
The base of the meadow down from the parking lot. Does that sound familiar?
Oh, just directly below the east side lookout down there.
Feel free to clarify if you're still on, Joni. Well, let's skip to the next one then.
I don't
know.
Teresa asked a question that I think might also be a teaser for one of the future webinars. But given the potential for invasive plant species to increase with disturbance, how is this considered in evaluating management options of removing trees and the potential use of fire? Are there monitoring efforts to see how non-natives may be expanding?
That is a teaser for the next one. In fact, yeah, we have the people that are doing it. So yeah, stay tuned. Come back next time.
Perfect. Well, that's actually all the questions that have come through. So that might be the great way to end this tonight. So thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in with us. Oh, Joni chimes in. Let's see if this helps at all. So I believe it's about 300 feet from the top parking lot to the west.
300 feet from the top parking lot. 300.
That sounds like it's where the old the original campground was. You go west from the parking lot out across that meadow where the Mary's Peak Trek was, and then there are a line of trees down there. And there used to be the original campground was there, and that may be what you're talking about. It's been a long time since I went in there. That was the one that was destroyed with the big blowdown that Kevin showed.
Yeah, I agree with you, Phil, because the picnic area and campground was right in that area, so it's probably some remnant of that.
Joni says that sounds right to them.
Okay,
That seems like that could be it.
If it's near Parker Creek, remember Parker Creek starts on the east side and wraps around the lower meadow there. There is some metal detritus at one point in the creek, which I won't describe exactly where or what it is, but should be removed. But I don't remember. A chain fence or whatever it was doesn't sound like it. Yeah.
No, now if you go really near the upper end of the Parker Creek up there, that's where the original water intake was, and there used to be a box and things for that.
Yeah,
probably still up there.
Yeah, so no.
Right.
Well, I think then in closing, it's like we've had a lot of impacts. We didn't even talk about climate change. Phil has looked at some old documents that show Mary's Peak used to have up to 35 feet of snow accumulated. We don't have that anymore. Now that's another impact, but it's not by walking on the meadow, or taking a bulldozer up there and scalping as they say, the summit. But it's really having a huge impact, and they'll be talking more about that in the next session.
Great.
So,
well, I hope you all can join us for our next sessions. And thank you again, Kevin, Dave, and Phil. That was really fascinating. I learned so much. Alex chimes in. Thank you all. Very interesting talks. That was really cool. I learned so much about Mary's Peak that I never knew.
Bonnie.
So thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Thank you.
Okay.
And just a reminder,
everybody.
we'll email a recording to everybody. So be sure to share this with your friends and loved ones and people who love Mary's Peak. So good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
Bye.